Welcome into episode 41 of the Josh Hendrickson Show. I'm Neal McCready here in the Clark Ford Studios, joined in the Clark Ford Studios by the aforementioned Josh Hendrickson, Chair of Economics at the University of Mississippi. He is all dressed up because he is going to a graduation ceremony at the aforementioned University of Mississippi. I'm dressed like this because I'm not, and I'm going to go get some exercise after this is over as I get myself mentally prepared for game 2 of the Western Conference semifinals this evening between the Denver Nuggets and my beloved yet bewildering Oklahoma City Thunder. Josh, how are you?
Doing well.
All right, we'll get the Cubs stuff out of the way. Are you worried about the Cubs at all? Are we okay?
No, they're going to win the NL Central. I'm going to stick to my prediction. I think they're going to win the NL Central. I think they're going to win it easily, to be honest. Beyond that, I don't know how far they can get.
They have to address some things at the deadline. They're going to have to address the bullpen for sure. I think they have to address third base. I think everything else offensively is good.
Yeah.
And they might need another starter depending on the whole Shota thing.
Well, and I mean, it depends. That doesn't look – the early word is that doesn't look too bad. So, I mean, really the thing is it's not too bad to have a starter, miss a week or two throughout the season.
Yeah. Can make you fresh later.
Yeah, but if it gets any longer than that, then I heard that you took crap for calling it the disabled list, by the way, which was
I did. I was reminded that it is not the disabled list, that is not politically correct, that it is the injured list, and so I stand corrected.
Are you allowed to still say DL though? Can you say DL and then people just figure it out?
I mean. We grew up with the DL.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean, I'm sorry. I'm not making fun of people who are handicapped, obviously, but they called it the disabled list because the people have been disabled from playing. Not that they're maimed or anything, or that there's something wrong with them, or that a person who has a handicap is a lesser person than a person who isn't handicapped. It's just a damned baseball term. People get so weird about the stupidest things. Look, if it were up to me, I'd change the Commanders back to the Redskins, the Guardians back to the Indians, and I'd call it the disabled list. And I would tell people it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. All those years that we called it the disabled list, everything was okay.
Well, the other thing, too, is when you change things and then you expect everybody to just instantaneously adapt their brain to this thing that you just changed 5 minutes ago is also unreasonable. So when you've called something for, 40 years and then they change it and you get it wrong, I think you could be forgiven for getting it wrong. I don't think that your brain has to automatically adapt within 5 minutes of this thing being changed to now say use some other phrase, other term.
Yeah. It's so stupid. It's like I heard that I think it was, I'll give credit where credit's due. Barstool Sports was doing a thing where they're asking everybody what's your one sports do-over, like your what if. And a guy that's a Cleveland fan said, if there just hadn't been a damn rain delay in Game 7, the Guardians would have won. And I said, no, they wouldn't have. The Indians would have won. But not the Guardians.
Yep.
We don't have – and the Indian logo was really cool. It was funny. I liked it. I have no attachment to the Cleveland baseball franchise, but I liked that hat. It was a cool hat. I never looked at that and went, you know what? Because of that hat, I'm going to make fun of Native Americans. It didn't happen. Same for the Redskins, for that matter. I mean, I didn't ever associate the Redskins with racism. I associated it with RFK Stadium, Joe Theismann, Joe Gibbs. By the way, I met Joe Gibbs's grandson at Talladega last week. He's like 5 feet tall. It's crazy. The what do they call him? Charles Manley, the defensive lineman that just devoured people. Darryl Green, who played cornerback for like 40 years. The Hogs up front. You know what they called them? The offensive line was the Hogs. I I associated them with the rivalry with the Cowboys and with the Giants and the Eagles and that's what I did. I mean, I just didn't ever think of it. And I don't know. I mean, I think they ought to bring it back. I think people would immediately get excited about it.
Well, they also picked the lamest replacement names ever. The
Yeah.
Guardians is a horrible name.
Oh,
Like, it's absolutely horrible.
yeah.
The Commanders. I mean, you could. I mean, you could go find like a 5-year-old on the street and say, "What should we name our football team?" They would have come up with something better than the Commanders, right?
Yeah.
It's just, yeah,
Yeah. Now that said, Utah today, their hockey team came out with the Mammoths.
yeah,
I like it.
yeah.
That's
No,
good.
that was good.
That's solid.
Yeah.
That's solid. And they did it the right way. They said, we're not going to rush into something. We'll just go this first year when we're not going to win anything. We're going to call ourselves the Utah Hockey Club. We'll figure this out. We're going to do this the right way. We're going to really think about it. And they did. And they came up with a good name that's going to stick, good color scheme, the whole deal. It's going to work. We did so many things a few years ago in the name, and we're going to talk about it with your your faculty meeting. We did so many things in the name of political correctness that were just stupid. Just like sometimes you have to tell your kids it's okay to everything can't offend you. Everything can't offend you. It like I've had people mess with me sometimes about they know I like the Thunder and they're like you who's your favorite player? And I'll name multiple players and they're like it's not Alex Caruso. And I know immediately what we're getting at. Oh, okay, so the bald white guy, right? That's what bald white guy. We got to all stick together. And I can't get offended by that. I've kind of embraced it. Like I think for Halloween this year, I'm going to be Alex Caruso. I'm just going to get a headband and get an Alex Caruso jersey, and no one will get it. I'll send a picture to Carson. He'll laugh, and that'll be the extent of it. But I'll get it. It'll be funny. I'm just going to play with it myself. Nope. Phrasing. But that's I don't know why everything has to be so serious about stuff like sports names.
Well, also though, it's a sign of it's actually a sign of the problems in civilization, because when political things start taking over every single aspect of your life, like that, when politics becomes a totalizing force, this is bad for society. And that's what you're seeing. I mean, the joke that people routinely make about this is like, it's like there was a day when you were living in Germany when all of a sudden, like, you picked up like a magazine that was about cats and they were talking about Nazi cats, like you knew you were in trouble. And that's the thing, is that when politics start to invade every aspect of your life and you cannot escape, that's a huge problem for society. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here, is that politics has invaded every aspect of your life. And if you try to avoid politics in any way, you're like scolded for ignoring it.
Along those lines, I didn't bring this up to you. So if you don't want to get into this, or you don't feel like you're educated enough on this particular topic to dive in, just tell me and we'll move on. The president, Donald Trump, today, I think after his meeting, he spoke at the University of Alabama's graduation recently. Nick Saban was there. Tommy Tuberville was, I think, flew on Air Force One there and back. And so, of course, they are extolling the horrors of modern intercollegiate athletics as it pertains to NIL and all of the lack of regulation. And Trump said he's going to form a commission, which is code for, hey, I'm going to put a bunch of people together and let them talk. My opinion is nothing against the president or his ideas here, but that just shouldn't be anywhere near the front of the list of things that the president and the government. I mean, Tommy Tuberville, as much as he wants to talk about football, you're a sitting U.S. senator. You got bigger fish to fry right now than football or college sports. Am I crazy for just saying? I keep waiting for Trump or someone else to just look at college athletics administrators and say, "You guys created this mess. Fix it yourself." I mean, that shouldn't be Congress's job.
Well, so I think it's a little bit complicated, and one of the reasons it's complicated is like this is operating through universities. Universities take a lot of federal funding, so if you're going to take a lot of federal funding, you should expect that the federal government's going to weigh in on things. I think we mentioned this with respect to Harvard last time. Like, if Harvard doesn't like what the federal government is saying, well, welcome to the rest of the world, right? Like, there were a lot of people who were opposed to what the federal government was telling them to do in years past, and they were stuck doing it because you're going to take our money. You're going to do what we say. That's kind of the attitude. So the extent to which they receive federal funding, I mean, that at least gives them an excuse to be involved. I mean, I think the other issue, though, is that the problem with college sports right now is that it's entirely being run through courtrooms. And so the courts are essentially just ruling that, oh, no, you can do that, or, oh, no, you can't do that, or whatever. And so the problem is, though, this actually really begs the question of, like, what does the NCAA do? Like, should the NCAA...
Well, it was once the governing body of intercollegiate athletics, and it's really lost its teeth. It no longer has... It's a law enforcement agency that doesn't have the ability to arrest. Or it's sort of like an HOA in many ways.
Well, but I mean, that's the thing is what the courts have essentially done is they continue to rule that, like, well, that all the rules that the NCAA has, they can't actually have those rules, or they can't enforce those rules. So everybody just kind of keeps going, like, issue by issue. You know, like, so these college athletes, like, they want something, like they want, more years of eligibility,
Yep.
or they want to be able to transfer more often. And so what's happening is the courts continue to rule over and over and over again that, like, you don't have the authority to do that. Like, you can't do that. Well, if you can't do that, like, there are so many things that they've been ruled that they cannot do that you start to wonder, well, what can they do? Because the judges never clarify, like, this is what the NCAA is allowed to do, and this is what they're not allowed to do, because they're just ruling on these individual cases.
Right.
And so what they're doing is the NCAA has this list of rules, and the judges are basically just going through there and occasionally just scratching one off, like, nope, can't do that. And so the question is, well, what about the ones that haven't been scratched off? Like, are those still okay, or are they still, or are they only in place until somebody brings a lawsuit about that issue? And so I do think that there's going to be, it's unclear how this is going to be resolved, but it's going to have to be resolved in some way where there's some oversight. So, I mean, it's possible that, I mean, I have very low hopes for, like, a commission on college athletics. I have very low hopes for that. But it's possible that something like that could lead to, like, a new organization to oversee with clearly defined rules and things of that nature. Because all of these rules are being set in the court system. They're all being set according to laws that are on the books about competitiveness, about labor markets. And so this naturally raises the question of, like, well, what does the NCAA do? And there's also a really weird thing here where the NCAA has had these rules for a really long time.
Yep.
And those have been the rules. And now a court comes along and says, well, that's not the rule. You can't have that rule. And so the question is, like, is this just, would this have happened sooner if people were bringing lawsuits sooner? Or is this a change in sort of how courts interpret the law? Is this a change in labor? Is there a change in labor law that brought this about? Is there a change in competition law that brought this about? So there are all these, there's a bunch of antitrust law involved here. So the question becomes, what do you do? Because to me, the issue with college sports is the way that I always put this is, like, one of my favorite economists was a guy named Armin Alshin. And Armin Alshin just used to say, you tell me the rules and I'll tell you how people are going to behave. And that's how he described, like, what economists do. And the issue here is that nobody can actually tell you the rules. And so because nobody can tell you the rules, like, you can't predict how people are going to behave.
Right.
And also people are, even when people do tell you the rules, somebody just decides, I don't like that rule, and they go to court, and then the court decides whether it's a rule. And, like, recently, those decisions are just like, nope, can't enforce that. And so the issue here is, at some point, either the NCAA is going to have to much more clearly define like what the rules are and have a sort of reset, or something's going to have to replace the NCAA that's going to oversee college athletics, because there's going to have to be some sort of structure. There's going to have to be some sort of rules involved. Even if the rules are the same as what they are in this sort of like chaotic period, there's going to have to be some oversight, some rule maker, and then somebody who's able to enforce those rules.
That's the key.
Yep.
Is they have rules now, but I'm on an HOA here. How I don't know. I keep telling myself get off, quit. But we had a Zoom meeting the other day and someone brought up traffic things that are happening in our neighborhood. And it is becoming more dangerous. It's becoming more hazardous. And I stopped it. I was like, we can sit here and talk about this for 20 minutes. We have no ability to do anything about it. We have no teeth. We can send out a letter to people who live in the neighborhood to, hey, please beg your kids to drive without their phone in their hand. Slow down. Don't race over the speed bumps. Be aware that there's traffic. Be aware that we're getting into summer and people are out more and kids are out and dogs and et cetera. But there's no ability to enforce it. So if you really wanted to enact change at a neighborhood level, you have to have some sort of enforcement penalty structure in place. And that's where college sports kind of doesn't have that anymore. I mean, the NCAA for the longest time ignored problems that were on the horizon until they couldn't. And the courts have ruled against them over and over and over. And now the NCAA has been rendered useless in many ways. And suddenly the inmates, for lack of a better term, are sort of running the asylum. The players are winning basically every court hearing they're winning. And so now the same college administrators who just threw up their hands basically in 2020 and said, yeah, do whatever, they're now looking to Congress and stuff to help. And Congress isn't going to help. It's pretty obvious after all these years, and Ted Cruz and others have said it. They have a bipartisan, but nothing gets done because I don't know that anybody has the true appetite to get that done, whatever that done is. I don't even know what it is. I don't even know how you fix it now. I just published my mailbag at rebelgrove.com and had multiple questions about NIL and the future of college athletics. And I've gotten where I feel like I'm repetitive. I don't know that there's a quote fix because I'm not as convinced as everyone else that it's broken. I think there's just basically this Wild West, unregulated free market that is out there. And as long as people are going to games and TV ratings are where they are and the TV people will pay what they're paying for broadcast rights and streaming rights, I just think this is kind of where we're headed.
Well, and we could resolve this. I mean, we could resolve this through court cases. I mean, eventually it could be that schools start. So now most of the litigation is player driven, but you can imagine schools start to become a source of litigation as well. So you've already seen this multiple times where a player plays for one team in the fall, transfers to another team in the spring, then transfers to another team in the fall. There's actually interesting questions about contract law here, because if you were paying them in the spring and they technically weren't playing, did they fulfill the obligations of the contract? And if they didn't fulfill the obligations of the contract, then technically they should owe you any money that they collected.
And we have a couple of those cases brewing now. Like I think I know there's two at Arkansas. Maybe there's one somewhere else, but those are the ones that everyone's watching with, ironically, Nico Iamaleava's younger brother, Madden. They're watching to see what happens with that because Arkansas is simply saying, we made a payment that you didn't fulfill and we would like that payment back. And the player is arguing, no, I showed up and I practiced and I did the things that I was charged to do. The fact that I didn't stay for an actual season is not breach of contract. And that's going to go in front of a court at some point, years from now, I suppose. And I don't think Arkansas is as hung up on the actual $200,000 as it is a lot of, and I'm sourced on this, a lot of other schools around are like, you please pursue this. Be the lead here, because this is a thing we all have to address.
Well, and so the issue is it's possible that this could get worked out through the court system, but that's going to take years and years and years. And the other way that the other way is we could just see more conference consolidation, because if you saw more conference consolidation, the conferences themselves can start imposing their own rules with the consent of the members, and that and then that can potentially change things. The problem is what happens when the conferences come up with different rules, because they're going to want to have the best rules for themselves. But so every rule that they create is going to try to be like, to create a competitive advantage.
Therein, not to interrupt, but therein lies the rub, right? The actual fix is something that would be everyone kind of saying, hey, these are going to be our rules, and we're all going to stick to them. No one's going to skirt these rules. We're all going to agree that we're going to stick to those rules. That would absolutely fix it. I don't know that the athletics environment allows for that.
Yeah, and I think but the main issue is that you can't predict what's going to happen, because there are no rules. There's no clear guidance. Even the rules that exist, you have no idea if that will exist 6 weeks from now. So you're going based on what you know today, and what you know today could change dramatically a month from now. And so it's very, very difficult to predict. And if you just think about this as any other market, like no other market functions this way. Like if I decide that I want to go buy a new car, I have a sense of like what the cars that I'm looking at, I have a sense of what they cost. And if I show up at a car dealer and there's no sticker in the window and I say, hey, I really like this truck, what's this selling for? And he says, I can't tell you.
Make an offer.
Then, what's it worth to you? What are you willing to pay for this truck? Then that's not going to be a very effective market.
And if you were to say, hey, what's the cost on this truck? And he says, well, another gentleman has made an offer, and you say, well, how much was that offer? Well, I can't tell you that. You'll have to guess. You would walk away from that car dealer. But where we are in sports right now, with especially football and men's basketball, is exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
How much would it cost for us to get this player? Well, he's got offers. How much are the offers? Can't tell you that.
And the stakes are different, right? Because if I walk away from buying the new truck, like I'm able to do that because I have another car that I can drive to work.
Right.
And I just need to get from place A to place B. That's all I need. I'm not going to get fired from my job because when I pull into work, they're like, that's not a nice enough car. That thing is too old. You got to get rid of that, and you got to get a new one. That's not going to happen. But
unless it's a Tesla. Okay. Because that's a bridge too far.
In college athletics, if you say, oh, I'm just not, if you're not going to tell me that, then I'm just, we're not in this market. I'm just not going to do that. Well, if that's a really good player and that's a difference maker on your team, that could be the difference between you getting fired and you keeping your job. And so that really changes the decision-making process.
Yeah.
And so, the issue is that this is a market where there's no rules and no prices. And so good luck to you.
All right. We'll jump into a story today. It's everywhere, but Wall Street Journal, I'll use them because this was updated about an hour ago. The Federal Reserve, I'm reading from the Wall Street Journal. The Federal Reserve warned that the economy, making sure I didn't skip, I didn't, that the economy faced growing risk of higher unemployment and higher inflation due to tariff increases when officials agreed to hold interest rates steady on Wednesday. Quote, this is from Jerome Powell, the Fed chair. If the large increases in tariffs that have been announced are sustained, they're likely to generate a rise in inflation, a slowdown in economic growth, and an increase in unemployment, end quote. Tariffs represent a shock that can decrease an economy's ability to supply goods or services while sending up prices. The unpredictable rollout of increased duties on imported goods threatens to sap profits and chill new investment until businesses have more clarity on their underlying cost structure. The policy changes pose a dilemma for the Fed, which has had to decide whether to focus more on the potential for inflation to go up or more on the risk of rising unemployment. They're in a bad situation, said William English, a former senior Fed advisor. If I were there, I would be suggesting that they stay put for now. I know there's a lot there. We'll dive into the tariffs some more, but your thoughts on what Powell said?
So the thing that I'm really concerned about here is that the Federal Reserve has a history of making very significant errors. And the messaging that I'm seeing coming out of the Federal Reserve, I think, gives me some concern that they're going to make things worse. And the reason that I say that is monetary policy can't create more goods and services, right? They can vary the money supply, and by varying the money supply, that can affect the demand for goods and services. But the point is that policymakers use monetary policy to try to move aggregate demand around, right? Like they're trying to. So if spending falls in the economy, you've got falling prices and you've got a decline in economic activity. If you increase, if you move towards an expansionary monetary policy, what happens is that tends to push those prices back up, but it tends to push economic activity back up, right? And so when prices and quantities are moving in the same direction, that's when monetary policy can actually have an effect on the economy. When prices and quantities are moving in opposite directions, which is what the Fed themselves says is going to happen from the tariffs, right? So they're saying, look, prices are going to go up, economic activity is going to go down. If we take them at their word that that's what's going to happen, then there's no role for them at all. Because in situations like that, what you're describing a situation either temporary or permanent where there's just more scarcity of goods.
Mm-hmm.
And they can't create more goods. They can influence the demand for those goods by, changing interest rates, by buying and selling assets. They can influence the demand for those goods, but they can't create those goods. And so in economics, what we typically think about is we think about demand shocks versus supply shocks, right? So sometimes something happens to the economy that primarily affects demand. And so if it primarily affects demand, quantities and prices are moving in the same direction. Mm-hmm. And the Fed can actually have some influence on that. So if demand is suddenly a lot higher, then you might want to contract monetary policy to prevent that from leading to inflation. Because typically, if you have this shock to demand, it's generally caused by policy. It's generally because fiscal policy, they're spending more money, like the federal government spending more money, or it's generally caused by monetary policy being too expansionary. And so in instances like that, you want the central bank to actually have contractionary monetary policy to keep us, sort of at the economy's potential. So if you look at a chart of real GDP in the United States, right, total production in the United States, if you look at it over a long period of time, there's a trend. Okay, that trend is generated by real factors like your labor force, the amount of capital that you have, what kind of technology you have, right? But you have this trend, and then in the short run, you've got these little deviations from that trend. So typically, those deviations from the trend are demand driven. Like sometimes demand is a little high, sometimes demand is low, and in those situations, the Federal Reserve can potentially use monetary policy to push us back towards the trend. But when we're talking about actual supply issues, so when we're talking about things that are higher prices, lower quantities, there's nothing the Federal Reserve can do about those things. And so because there's nothing that they can do about those things, we don't want them to do anything. And so the messaging that we're getting from the Fed is really, really strange, which is, we're very concerned that we're going to have higher prices and lower economic activity. But the messaging out of that should be, but there's nothing we can do about that. That's beyond our control. So if we see higher prices and lower economic activity, that's just because there's temporarily some scarcity in the economy because of these tariffs. And there's nothing we can do about that. So we should kind of stand back from that. The problem is that they keep talking about this as well, this is inflationary. This is inflationary. Well, no, it's not inflationary. Even if the United States consumer paid the entire tariff, and we've talked about reasons why that we shouldn't expect consumers to pay the entirety of the tariff, but even if they did, this would be a one-time effect on those prices that are coming in, right? So prices would rise, but one time, right?
Right.
Like they're not going to rise year after year after year because you have the tariff. And so there's nothing that the Federal Reserve should do about that. They should just allow those changes to happen, and they should sort of stay out of it. And my concern is I think that a lot of times when they see things that generate economic weakness, they want to immediately go towards expansionary policy. And if they move towards expansionary policy and there are these adverse supply effects from the tariffs, then that actually makes the situation worse, because that could potentially lead to stagflation, where we have like low economic growth and high rates of inflation.
Reading from the same story, and I don't know that I completely understand this. You'll be able to explain it or to agree or disagree with it. It says some economists worry that rate cuts could worsen inflation. If rate cuts cushion the economy and support steady income growth, they could lead businesses and consumers to accept paying higher prices. Fed officials believe those expectations are self-fulfilling. The thinking goes like this: if consumers and businesses believe inflation will be low and stable over time, these well-anchored expectations can play a critical role to ensure that a run-up in prices doesn't repeat. Because the economy has just been through a period of high inflation, assuming that customers and businesses will expect inflation to decline after an initial increase is a bad risk for the central bank to take, said Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Moving faster to cut rates now raises the risk that the Fed will have to reverse course months later by increasing rates, Posen said. Several Trump allies said last year the Fed was stoking risk of more persistent inflation by moving rates down too fast. It is very ironic and frankly self-contradictory for people in or close to the administration who were critical about the Fed being too inflationary to also argue that the tariff shock is not going to have any effect on inflation, Posen said. It's one or the other.
You should never listen to Adam Posen. But that's one thing. But okay, but I will say this. Okay, so there's a couple issues here.
Okay.
So the first thing is part of this I agree with, is that one of the concerns that you would have is they see is that it's possible that the tariffs are going to result in economic reallocation. So if they create reallocation where you're moving around production, right, in the short run, you're just going to have less total production. Okay, so like if people are reshoring jobs to the United States, for example, right, like if they're moving their factory from Canada into the United States or wherever, right?
Okay.
Well, what that means is temporarily that factory is not going to produce anything, right? And so there would be lower economic activity in the short run while you're sort of changing the location of where you produce stuff.
Going through the process of moving, right.
And so what these tariffs are doing to some extent is they're going to change relative prices because we're going to have different tariffs on different people. And so what that's going to do is that's going to create incentives for reallocating our resources geographically. If you are reallocating those things geographically, you're going to get lower economic activity in the short run. And that lower economic activity is really a supply shock, right? People are turning off production temporarily to relocate it somewhere else. So you tend to get less production, higher prices. So you don't want the Fed to do anything in those scenarios, because if they look at the higher prices and they say, oh, prices are up, we need to tighten monetary policy, we need to raise interest rates, that's going to be bad because it's going to worsen the reduction in economic activity. So it can potentially cause us to go into a recession. On the other hand, if they look at the decline in economic activity and they say, oh, these tariffs are pushing us into a recession, we've got to lower interest rates, well, that's going to make prices go up even more, right? And so what you want the Federal Reserve to do is to do nothing. You want them to allow this economic reallocation to happen, and to sort of see it through, because you don't want them to either create a recession or create inflation from this from this change. But the thing is that the messaging from the messaging from the Federal Reserve is not clear, because the messaging from the Fed is kind of like, hey, we're concerned about all of these things, but they're not actually telling you what they would do in response to all of these things. They're kind of like, well, we're not going to do anything right now, right? But the thing is that based on what they described, they should actually be outlining, hey, we see these things as supply side factors. This is all just about like the availability of goods and services. This is not about like a lack of demand. Okay, so there's nothing we can actually do about this to solve this problem. So we're going to stay out of this and we're going to let things settle. However, if we see other signs of weakness or if we see other signs of inflation, then we're going to do that. This latter point about, oh, tariffs are going to cause inflation, this is what I'm talking about. This is, you know, tariffs are not going to cause inflation unless the Fed makes it so. Like we saw this in the 1970s.
If I guessed Rosen's political bent, I would understand where he's coming from.
Yes,
here.
you could get that very easily. I mean, here's the deal. Here's the way to think about it. One way to think about it is the 1970s. In the 1970s, we had an oil shock, right? The OPEC countries got together, raised oil prices, reduced the supply of oil. That's a supply shock. Okay, so there's less oil. It's more, and as a result, it's more costly. But there's nothing like the Federal Reserve can do about that.
Right.
Like they could try to lower the price of oil by like restricting monetary policy, but that's actually just going to make the problem worse. Okay, because it's going to reduce the demand for oil at the same time as the supply has been reduced. They can look at the decline in economic activity, which is what they did, and say, oh, we need more expansionary policy. We need to lower interest rates and have expansionary policy because look at this decline in economic activity. But when you do that, now the problem is you exacerbate those price increases, because now the prices of other goods start to go up because you're expanding monetary policy, right? You're pushing more and more money out into the system. And so at a time of like, you know, elevated prices because of supply problems, you're going to make the price of everything go up because the price of oil has gone up. That's not a good solution. And so it's a similar argument with the tariffs. Like, to the extent that tariffs are going to increase prices, it's going to be a temporary increase in prices. Like prices are going to go up in the short run. Okay. And then some of those prices are going to fall, but they're not going to continuously go up year after year after year from the tariffs, right? To the extent that they go up at all, it's going to be a one-time effect. Now, it might take place over like a 3-month period or a 6-month period, but it's not going to be a continuously, it's not going to be this continuous increase in prices over time. And so the Federal Reserve needs to stay out of it. So in comparing this to like COVID or whatever Posen is doing here is the complete wrong comparison. This is the complete wrong comparison in the sense that what we're talking about here is we're talking about how the Federal Reserve is responding to these external forces. The Federal Reserve should do nothing about these external forces. To the extent they do something, they're only going to make things worse. And to the extent that tariffs cause inflation, they're only going to cause inflation if the Federal Reserve makes it so. If the Federal Reserve responds to tariffs by saying, hey, we're seeing weakening economic activity, we're going to lower interest rates, then we will get inflation, because you're going to be pushing interest rates down to try to boost demand at a time where supply is short. If supply is short and you boost demand, what happens? Prices go up. Right. So
that's kind of fundamental. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we don't want the Federal Reserve to be doing anything. And these are not going to cause inflation unless the Federal Reserve accommodates these things by trying to boost demand in response to what they see as declining economic activity.
I want to move on to another topic, but I'm fascinated by this because you're picking this thing apart. The last part of the story, some economists have argued the situation today is fundamentally different from the 2021 inflation shock that humbled the Fed and other central banks. Back then, the Fed was adding stimulus to an economy buffeted by broad imbalances in goods, housing, and labor markets. Today, labor markets are cooling, and slowing wage growth could provide less fuel to sustain inflation after an initial tariff-driven boost to prices. Market based expectations of inflation over the next 5 to 10 years, as derived from Treasury inflation protected securities, have been at the low end of the range seen over the last year. And then there's a quote from someone whose last name is Gonzalez, and I don't know who he is or she is. I'll try to figure it out. George Gonzalez, head of U.S. macro strategy at MUFG, Japan's largest bank. He says, I know why the Fed is leaning towards focusing on inflation expectations, but look at the bond market. The inflation vigilantes are non-existent.
Well, first of all, the inflation expectations thing, that's another aspect of this. First of all, we got to dispense with this whole thing. There is a belief among a lot of people in policy circles that inflation expectations cause inflation. That like, oh, people expect inflation and then like, and then that's when we get inflation. Well, where do these expectations come from? Like, does everybody just wake up in the morning and go, you know what? Inflation is coming. And then all run to the store to buy things? Like, no, that's not what happens. If you look at inflation expectations, it's very, very clear that the causation is running in the opposite direction. What people expect inflation to be is based on what they've observed about inflation in the past.
Yes.
So in periods of high inflation, inflation expectations start to rise. In periods of low inflation, inflation expectations fall. So that's one issue. And so to the extent that policymakers are worried about inflation expectations, then we should also be concerned, because that suggests that they're going to make another mistake. The other thing is, like, Posen is comparing, like, the Posen is comparing the sort of post-COVID inflation to like the potential inflation we're going to have here. And like, and look, I think that I think that the point, I would agree that these would be very, very similar things, but for the completely opposite reason as him. Okay. So like what he's saying is, oh, we had all of these supply shortages and look at how much inflation that caused, right? What I would say is, yeah, we had all of these supply shortages, and at the same time, the Federal Reserve was like pumping the economy with as much money as they possibly could. So you had a reduction in demand, or you had a reduction in supply, and then they were trying to solve that problem by increasing demand. So if you've got a reduction in supply and you've got an increase in demand, you're going to get higher prices. You're going to get inflation. Okay, so it's the same thing here. If they respond to temporarily higher prices as a result of the tariffs by putting more and more money into the economy, yes, this is going to lead to inflation, but that's not the cause. The tariffs aren't the cause of that. The central bank is the cause of that, in the same way that the central bank was the cause of the inflation that we experienced coming out of COVID. Coming out of COVID, we all expected prices to go up for some period of time just because of the shortages.
Yes.
Okay. The issue is that the Federal Reserve at the same time was pumping more and more money into the system.
Ridiculous amount.
And not only were they pumping money into the system, but also the federal government was giving people checks in the mail, right?
Anyone who asked for one.
Right. And so the thing is that when you give people money to increase demand, that is going to cause higher prices. And if there's already a reduction in supply, the effect is all going to be on prices, because you can't get the goods to the market to meet that higher demand. And so you have to raise prices. And so the thing is that these events could be similar in the sense that if the Fed prints a bunch of money in response to the tariffs, yes, we'll get inflation again. And that'll be just like what happened during COVID. But they need to not do that. They need to not pump a bunch of money into the system, to try to deal with these tariffs. And so I think that, like, the issue here is that there's too many people who think that they're the smartest person in the room here. Like, this is the fundamental problem, is that policymakers think that they have all of this stuff sorted out. But the problem is that when you are met with unprecedented circumstances, the Federal Reserve performs very, very poorly. This was true of the Great Depression. This was true of the inflation of the 70s. This was true of the financial crisis. This is true of COVID, right? When they are presented with these unprecedented kind of events, they're overconfident in what they believe that they can accomplish, and then they make things worse. And that's what they've done throughout all of these significant events. And I'm worried that they're going to do that here, because when I listen to Posen acts like, oh, this is going to be super inflationary, and then the Fed's going to have to decide what to do about this. And it's like, no, it's not going to be super inflationary. First, that's number one.
Okay.
Second of all, to the extent that it is inflationary at all, it's temporary. Okay. Third, to the extent that it's inflationary at all, this is a supply shock, which the Federal Reserve can do nothing about. They don't produce things,
Right.
So they can't increase quantities. And so given those 3 points, they need to step aside, and they should monitor things because there are other things going on in the world and the economy, and they need to monitor those things. But like, they should not be responding to tariffs in the way that's being described here, because the only way that they can, if they're going to base policy on the tariffs, they're only going to make things worse.
Speaking of tariffs, what is your thought on where things stand right now with this sort of tariff standoff between the U.S. and China?
So I think this is actually the main event. This is what this whole thing has really been about. I think that the other stuff about the tariffs, like, I do think that there are other countries where people in the administration want higher tariffs on those other countries than what we had in the past. But by and large, what this whole thing has long been about is a reset with China. That's what this has really been about. China is in many ways a terrible trading partner. I've seen lots of people talking about, production coming from China, has brought us lower price goods and that sort of thing. Okay, but there's a lot behind the lower price goods. Okay, like, there's allegations that they use slave labor. Okay, the Chinese use very deceptive, like, trade practices. Their policy is deliberately designed for, to benefit the Chinese, even if it's at the expense of someone else. And so this is what the whole thing has been about for the longest time, is really getting China to the table. And I think what's really interesting about this is that for a long time, I think we talked about this last time, that, like, the real motivation for having such high tariffs on China is you need to sort of ramp up the pressure on them in order to relieve the pressure, right?
Yeah.
And that's because China. So what I've been hearing from, all the people who say that this policy is not going to work, what I've been hearing from those people is China's never going to negotiate. They don't have to negotiate. Xi's going to be in power long after Trump is gone. He can just wait him out.
Things are happening there, though. I mean, like the central bank in China is cutting interest rates. They're injecting liquidity into the financial systems. They're releasing around $139 billion of liquidity. The cutting interest rate. They're clearly being impacted by what's happening in Washington.
Yeah, and so one of the big things here that we have to recognize is, first, we have to recognize that the Chinese economy is not as strong as people believe it to be. And one of the reasons it's not as strong as we believe it to be is, like, yes, like, the Chinese have incorporated elements of a sort of capitalist system into their economy, but there is still a considerable amount of government involvement and government planning that goes into the economy. China for years has been building entire cities that nobody lives in, like, just to build things, just to keep production going. You can't do that in a market-based system. Like, you can't build things that nobody's going to use. That's a terrible use of resources. Actually, it's still a terrible use of resources in China, but it provides people with jobs in the short run, and
right.
it keeps things moving. So you have elements of that. The banking system in China has a ton of problems because there's so much government involvement in the banking system. There's so much risk that kind of gets swept under the rug. But at the end of the day, that risk is going to be borne by somebody. Okay. So first of all, the thing we have to recognize is that, China is not in this position, in like a huge position of strength that they're portrayed as being in the media. Like, they're not in a huge position of strength. There are a lot of weaknesses here that are, like, sort of glossed over, shall we say, by the media and by people who pay attention to these things, because they see this economic activity. And also, people have been predicting for 20 years that, what China's doing is unsustainable. And so every year that goes by, the more people discount that view and start to say, like, well, it's still going, well, it's still here, and so they start to think that that's not going to matter. But the point is they're not in the position of strength that people think they are. I don't think that people understand the extent. People always say, like, how are we going to decouple from China? Like, how are we going to be able to detach ourselves? We're so reliant on China for everything. Well, if that's true, that also means that they're so reliant on us.
Yes.
Okay. And so if this is costly for us, then it's also costly for them. And so the ramp up in the tariffs was really designed to get them to the table, to basically say, fine, we're going to make this so costly that you have no other choice but to come to us and actually negotiate. And so there's a couple of things here. Like one of the things that gets all the attention, one of the things that gets all the attention with respect to China is the fact that, like, we have like 145% tariffs on China right now. But the thing that people aren't talking as much about is, there's this exception that Chinese retailers exploit. Like, so these companies like Temu and places like that they exploit these, where if you're shipping something in that like has less than $800 in value, like it doesn't get inspected, it's not subject to tariffs, it just goes through. That's why these places like Temu are like, this is how they got their this is how they got their start. This is how they took off, because they're exploiting that loophole in the system that
Right.
already exists. And so, but the Trump administration, when they levied those tariffs, they also got rid of that exception. So that exception is now gone. So that's also incredibly costly for Chinese companies. The other thing that the United States is concerned about, which is another thing that nobody talks about, is everybody was like, well, why is the United States so mad about why is the United States so mad at Canada? Why does Trump keep mocking the Canadians? Like, what? First of all, let's be real. Donald Trump thinks that Justin Trudeau is just the wimpiest person of all time. Like, it's very clear, like, he just doesn't respect him.
Yeah.
And so part of the mockery is just that he's like, this guy, right? Like, how can I be standing next to this guy? How did you elect this guy, right? And
a fair question, by the way.
And so that's part of it. But the other part is that one of the other things that China has kind of done over the years is use other countries as sort of like a way station for their goods. So, for example, if you can import into the United States from Canada with no tariff, then maybe what the Chinese do is they ship things to Canada first. And then in Canada, you make some minor change to the packaging or something like that of the goods that you shipped in. And then now you ship it into the United States, and now you don't have to pay the tariff. And so if you do sort of things like that, like, now you're getting around these rules. Well, but you're only getting around those rules because the Canadians sort of allow this to take place. And of course the Canadians are going to allow this to take place because they're getting this, like, small boost in economic activity by having these little warehouses where this stuff gets repurposed and shipped out. And the problem is that for the United States looks at this and goes, no. Like, this is like tax fraud. Like, you are allowing them to just avoid paying taxes to us by just giving them a little way station where they can stop on their way here so that they don't have to pay these things. So that's another thing that that the United States is mad at both Canada and China about. But the fundamental point here is that what we've seen is that all of these people who said, who've told us that China's in a position of power, that China they don't have to negotiate with us, they can wait Trump out, they can do all these things. What you're seeing is, like, now the Chinese are actually saying, hey, we want to talk, we want to negotiate, we want to know what you want. And I think that is the important part of all of this, is that this has been the entire point all along. We've now gotten to that point where the Chinese want to talk, where they want to negotiate. And so now we're going to see what kind of deal that, Trump is the deal maker. So let's see what his administration can actually pull off.
Well, and there's pressure in China too, right? Some of these companies that make the goods are laying off employees. So therefore the employees, even in a communist country where people are motivated to be quiet, if enough people get loud, it does make noise. And some of those companies can move. I mean, some of the American companies can move the manufacturing from China to Vietnam or to Cambodia or other countries that have bent the knee at this point. I mean, I think it's like a big game of chicken right now between the two countries. I think the fear that some people have, I've heard this from people in my life, is that American companies are going to panic because Americans are quick to panic. They're going to panic. And they're going to start laying off employees. They're going to start hiring freezes, production freezes. There's not going to be the same holiday spending. We're going to have almost a self-inflicted wound here because of overreaction to what is very clearly just a standoff between two superpowers.
Well, I think that so there's a couple of things here. So number one, yeah, I mean, China, they don't face the same feedback that politicians in the United States face, right? So politicians in the United States have to worry about things like reelection. They have to worry about the success of their political party. In China, you don't really have to worry about elections, but you do have to worry about your rivals within the Chinese Communist Party. Like if you think that that Xi doesn't have to worry about some guy in the CCP who secretly sees himself as the next leader, then you're mistaken, right? There's somebody somewhere who is plotting Xi's downfall or waiting for the opportunity to seize power from him.
Of course.
And so he does have to, and so you can only do that when you have significant support, and you're only going to have significant support if there are weaknesses. Now, you already see the economic weaknesses in China because there are already reports coming out that we've seen dramatic reductions in orders, dramatic reductions in production. That you see their central bank already like lowering interest rates. There are lots of things that are going on here that that show that this is pretty costly for the Chinese, and they might not have to worry about elections. And Xi might think that, hey, he can outlast these things, but if this stuff gets costly enough, somebody's going to seize the moment, and they're going to try to remove him from power and put themselves into power. And that doesn't have to be like a revolution. All that would have to be is somebody within the CCP who just decides like, hey, it's my time, and and rally support behind that cause. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the difficult thing here is sort of, how do companies respond? I think that the arguments about uncertainty are a little bit overblown. We saw this a lot in the aftermath of the financial crisis, for example. Like, we have all of these measures of economic uncertainty, and there were tons of people who were saying, look at these measures of economic uncertainty. This is going to lead to reductions in investment. This is going to lead to this is going to cause companies in the United States to scale back their plans or not, build the new factory that they were going to build or what have you. And the thing is that when you look at the data, like, that just wasn't borne out in the data. Like, what tends to happen is like, yeah, you might get less investment now, but that's because people just wait, right? So people wait a little bit longer for more information before they decide what to do. And so it's possible that you that you see a sort of delay in investment projects. It's possible that you see these kinds of things, but you don't really observe those things directly, right? Like, unless a company makes an announcement like, hey, we're going to put off building this factory for 6 months. If they just didn't say anything, you would never know, because you don't see them not build a factory, right? Like, you assume that, like, if they don't build a factory, they weren't planning on building a factory.
Right.
And so so what happens is that when there's more uncertainty, people just tend to wait.
Yep.
And so because they want to get more information, and so they just kind of wait and see how the dust settles, and then after the dust settles, then they kind of decide. Now, that can be a hamper on economic activity because you are potentially losing out on investment projects that would be going on right now, and so there is a cost there. But it's not a cost that we would necessarily observe, at least not right away.
One more thing, and then we'll get to your faculty meeting, and we'll get you out of here because you got to get to graduation. Grind makes a post. He says, I wonder how the Section 8 cuts will impact us. That has to decrease our tax liability for sure. I think my overall question is, at the end, will Trump's economy be as hard for the Democrats to change, just like Obamacare has been hard for the GOP to change?
Well, I mean, that's one of the big questions about like all of the changes that are being made through the administration, because like a lot of these changes that are being made are being directed by the executive branch. And a lot of these are being made through the executive agencies.
Right.
And so if the Democrats were to win the next election, a lot of this stuff could be undone. Like, they could just go on a hiring spree. They could start doing all of the things that they were doing before that the Trump administration got rid of. I think to see sustained success, what you would have to see is a Republican, not just a Republican president, but a Republican president that agrees with Donald Trump, like somebody like J.D. Vance or something like that, if he were to become the next president, then I think this stuff gets harder to change, because the further you get down the road with these scaled down agencies, the harder it's going to be to scale them back up again. Because one of the things about what a lot of these agencies were doing is this was like slow growth, right? It's sort of like the frog boiling in water. Like these agencies are just getting bigger and bigger year after year after year, but you don't really notice it because the growth is from year to year is so small. But then all of a sudden you wake up 30 years later and you're like, whoa, this, this thing is, this agency is enormous. And what are they doing? Right. And so it's not just the size of the agency, it's the scope of the agency. And so I think that if you can have a prolonged period where these agencies can be scaled down, both in terms of like the amount of staff and in terms of the scope of what they're doing and the amount of money that's being allocated to these agencies to spend, then I think if you can get to that point, then it's going to be much harder to change going forward, because then you have to create the political will to redo a lot of the things that you were doing before. But it will be so long since you've done them that like you sort of have to like rally the political support behind that.
All right, I know how much you enjoy faculty meetings. You had a campus-wide faculty meeting recently. I know it was very meaningful to you. You got a lot of satisfaction from it. Can you give us some of the highlights?
I actually wasn't there. I only have secondhand information, so okay. I was busy working, so I wasn't able to be there. But the highlights, as they were described to me, the main highlight was the attack on academic freedom by the state of Mississippi, because the state of Mississippi passed this law that said that you have to get rid of all of your DEI programs, and this is an attack on academic freedom.
A lot of money's been invested in DEI. That's an industry now. And so when you come after it, you're coming after people's jobs and a way of, I mean, these are people that make cushy salaries to do nothing.
Well, first of all, I know there are legislators who listen to the podcast. So if you're listening to the podcast, let me just let you know that, number one, if you think that passing this law has eliminated the DEI stuff from these universities, you're wrong.
Yeah.
All they did was change their name. I don't know a single person who lost their job over this. Like everything, they just changed the name of everything and changed the mission of these offices.
Is this shit so baked in right now that we can't extract it? I know for a fact it is absolutely baked into corporate America. So I don't even know that you would even be able to go in and extract it in any phase of it out. And now you're telling me the same thing's happening at American universities, which we see everywhere.
Well, okay, there's a couple things here. So one, there's a sort of Mott and Bailey argument here. So like you see this on the internet, these Mott and Bailey arguments. What I mean by that is somebody will come out and they'll make some really provocative claim. Right. And then you challenge them on that claim. And then they resort back to like this much more like innocuous, less controversial claim. Right. Oh, I'm really just saying this. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of what the DEI stuff is like, if you actually listen to what they are saying, like a lot of this stuff is incredibly crazy and harmful. But then if you challenge them on that, they're like, look, this is just about equality. This is just about, making sure everybody's got the same opportunities.
Platitudinal.
Right. And so first of all, like one of the challenges here is that there are a lot of people who are supportive of this for ideological reasons, especially on university campuses, because they're overwhelmingly like left wing, and not just left wing, like they're sort of, very left wing.
Yeah.
So there's that. But I think there's also this sort of, there's these people in the middle who are kind of like, yeah, these people have kind of gone overboard, but like the sentiment is right. Right. And so they're kind of like supportive of the idea of the stuff. They just would like to trim the excesses. That's kind of their position on these things. But the problem is like this stuff is actively harmful. Like
yes.
it is activism on campus.
It's incredibly divisive.
It's activism on campus. It's activism on it is not about helping people. It is about punishing people.
Yes.
It is there's very much an aspect of cultural revolution to this thing, like making you say things whether you believe them or not, because that's the thing that you're supposed to say.
And it instills a fear of what happens to you if you are unwilling to say those things.
And these initiatives, I mean, all you have to do is actually look at what happens with these initiatives. When you look at these initiatives, they say, oh, this is just about like providing opportunities to people from like, this is about providing opportunities to Black scholars who never would have got those opportunities or something like that. Or this is an opportunity to promote female scholars, right, who never would have got these opportunities. And then the problem is that when you look at the beneficiaries of all these things, lots of them are just white guys. So first of all, like the outcomes don't match what you say that you're doing.
Right, precisely.
And the reason is the reason that the stuff is going to the white guys is those white guys have the correct ideology for the position, right? Like that's why they're finding themselves as recipients of awards. That's why they're finding themselves in like the positions that are created for this sort of a thing. And that is, and so that should be a huge red flag to anybody, right? The purpose of a thing is what it does. So if you have a thing and it keeps rewarding like mediocre white men, right, like into these positions, then you should assume that that's actually the point of the thing. Okay. So it doesn't matter what they say that the point is. Like you have to look at the actual outcomes.
Yes.
They're not changing anything. It's going to be very difficult to get rid of. The only way that you're going to get rid of this stuff is you have to have actual visionary leaders who are like, hey, listen, let me tell you what they're doing and why we're no longer going to do it, and who have to stand up and be willing to suffer the consequences of making those statements. The issue at universities, which we kind of touched on last time, is that nobody has the guts to do that. Nobody has the guts to be a leader at most of these places and say, hey, we're not doing this anymore.
Because the vocal minority is going to be incredibly vocal.
Right.
You are going to feel like you are wildly unpopular for a while.
Right. And so
when in reality, you may not be unpopular at all.
Well, and you see this, it's like everything is set up to try to get, well, first of all, okay, let me go back and reference this point about academic freedom. The idea that any of these people care about academic freedom is actually laughable.
Yes.
Like it is laughable. And when they say that, you should actually laugh in their face. Okay, because here's the thing. I've sat in meetings where people have said things like, you know, what about ideological diversity? And these very same people concerned about academic freedom are like, that's not even a thing. We shouldn't be concerned about that. Like, we should not be concerned with having people who represent other views. That's not what diversity is really about. No, that's the only argument for diversity, right? Is that you think that having multiple different views and perspectives is valuable.
Right.
That's literally the only justification for that sort of a thing. And so if you're going to say like, oh no, like actually we don't want that, then you're lying. And this is a trick. It's a trick. I've gone through this before on the podcast, and people need to understand this, is that the people on the left, especially the people on like the extreme left, they do not share your values. I'm not talking about like moderate Democrats. I'm not talking about people who like, you know, sort of like Joe Biden or something like that. No, I'm talking about the people who are committed, the activists, the people who are frankly driving the Democratic Party off a cliff. These people, they do not share your values, but they will appeal to your values. When they stand up there and say, this is a threat to academic freedom, they're not speaking to the other activists. They're not speaking to the other left-wing people. Those people are already on their team. When they stand up there and they say, this is a threat to academic freedom, what they're trying to get is they're trying to get people in the center and the right to look inside their heart and say, you know, this is against my principles. And even though I don't like this stuff, I really shouldn't be against it because it is, at the end of the day, about academic freedom. And so we should just, you know, I should not complain about this and I should let them do this. But let me tell you something. The very second that the roles are reversed and you appeal to academic freedom, they're not going to care about academic freedom anymore because they don't share your values. They weaponize your own values against you. And they do that to get what they want. They don't share your values. they're not making principled arguments. And that's what you have to understand in all of these things is what they try to do is they try to take every single issue and then they try to narrow that issue down to this very tiny little principle, like, oh, this is just a question of free speech, or this is just a question of academic freedom, or this is just a question of this. And in isolation, if you look at it that way, you can see that and you can say, well, that is kind of right. And so maybe I am the one who's wrong here. The problem is when the situation is reversed, they will never, they don't care. You can make that same principled argument. People say this all the time. They say like, oh, the left is so hypocritical. It's not hypocrisy. They're doing it on purpose. They don't share your values. They're not espousing academic freedom because they believe in academic freedom and that's what they're really after, and that you can come together and agree on that. No, that's not what they're doing at all. Like there's no agreement on principles. There's no agreement on values. It's about getting more power for themselves.
100%. And
when you look at these programs, you can see that this is exactly what it is, because it's like, let's make, they've sent out so many emails since this law was passed about how to proceed with policies in your department now that this law has been passed. I've deleted every single email. Do you know why? Because I never made a stupid policy about these things in the first place. So I don't have to worry about any of this stuff, because we never had.
That's why you didn't win an award at this faculty meeting.
Exactly. But this is why we never had these policies. And the reason that we never had these policies is I'm not going to require people who are applying for a job to write a diversity statement. Because first of all, that's coded ideologically.
Yep.
So anybody who is moderate or conservative is going to look at that and go, do I really want to be in this department? Like, are those the people in the department? Second of all, this is a trick that people use to get the sort of people that they want. Okay, so I actually went and met with these people early on, because when you first become chair, they want to meet with you and they want to talk about like what kind of things could you do. So when I met the people who were doing like the DEI stuff, and they said like, what kind of initiatives could you start? And what I said was, we're in Mississippi. There's a large percentage of the population that's black. Mm-hmm. There's a large percentage of that black population that is poor. Like, why don't we try to create some kind of scholarship for, poor black kids from Mississippi who want to study economics? They can come here. I'm sure, given the vast resources that you have at your disposal, I'm sure that we could do something like that. And so what I was told is, no, you can't. No, that would be discriminatory. And I'm like, okay, but
how?
Well, because they were like, oh, no, but let me tell you what they said to do. Okay.
All right.
So first of all, I laugh that they say this is discriminatory, right? Because first of all, your entire purpose is to be discriminatory. Like that's what like the DEI stuff is, right? Like you are literally saying we need to discriminate on these grounds, right? Like that's literally what you're saying. So first of all, it's contradictory because this is what they're doing, but they're not willing to do it. But here's what they wanted me to do. This is what they wanted me to do.
I'm fascinated.
This is what they wanted me to do.
Okay.
They said, what if you just created a scholarship, like just for anybody to apply, right? You could just create a scholarship. Anybody could apply. So you wouldn't exclude anybody from applying for this scholarship. Okay. But what you could do is you could have, as part of the requirement to get the scholarship, you could have them write like a personal essay about their experiences and how like diversity affected their lives and things like that. And what their point was, no, here's the thing. No. This is exactly what they said. Because if you make them write those statements, you can identify certain things about these people. Okay. So basically, the way I read between the lines, the way I read between the lines was, if I required a personal statement like that, then when I'm going through the applications, okay, the applications aren't going to tell me race, but when I read their personal statement, then maybe I'll know that they're race, and then I can just choose them based on those statements. And this is what I said to them. I said, so this is what you want me to do. So I suggested, okay, that if we want to have an initiative, maybe we give poor black kids from Mississippi scholarships to study economics. That was my idea. Your idea is we let everybody in Mississippi apply for this scholarship, and then we only give it to black kids. And then so you have all of these white kids who are going to apply for this, but we're going to rule them out through these personal statements, and then they're never going to get it. Like, so which one is more discriminatory? Which one is fair? Which one is actually honest about what you're doing?
The first one.
Yes. And
where you're saying, hey, this is the University of Mississippi. It's a public institution. You have a state that has, what is Mississippi? It's 40% African American. Like you said, many of those people are, not all certainly, but many come from areas that are impoverished. You're giving a young person an opportunity in a specific field that he or she may not be able to afford otherwise, and creating an opportunity for someone to rise above where they came from, which is the point of college.
Yep. No, and then what they wanted to do is waste a whole bunch of people's time. They wanted people to be able to apply who had zero chance of getting this. And I was like, no, I'm not doing this. This is the most ridiculous thing. What
was their reaction to you saying?
No, they just move on to the next thing.
Yeah,
they just move on to the next thing. I mean, look, the issue here is that this stuff is pernicious. It's designed, like, the reason that they want people to submit diversity statements is for the reason I just described with this scholarship. They might not be trying to identify somebody's race, or they might not be trying to identify, like how, this person's like income status or something like
ideology.
That. Exactly. What they're trying to get is, you can tell when somebody writes that statement, you can tell, are they a true believer or are they phoning this in? Did they plug this into ChatGPT, or did they really sit down and write this? And that's what it's really all about, because they're trying to get the people the right people in. I mean, I told you this before.
They want the people on their campus that will be the true believer. They don't want to run the risk of getting a kid on that campus who's bright, who unfortunately and unluckily was in a situation where he or she could not really, there was not much he or she could do as an adolescent, as a young person. But this is an opportunity for them to launch themselves, and they're going to view this thusly. And in a world where they leave, they're successful, and they move on, they look back and extol the virtues of hard work, of overcoming obstacles, as opposed to the victimization thing that is so rampant in the far left.
Well, and that's the other thing is,
and I'm nowhere near as articulate as you, but I think people sort of understand what I'm getting at here.
No, but I think this is the thing, is that, there are people who actually do valuable things. Like, I sit on the board of the Mississippi Council on Economic Education, and one of the things, that we oversee are these educational programs in Mississippi schools to just teach kids about personal finance and economics and just and basic things, right? And you see these successes when you go, and those successes, you see those successes in rich schools and poor schools.
Yeah.
You see them in predominantly white schools, predominantly black schools. You see them everywhere. Like, this is a huge benefit. And like, the thing is that things like that are an important initiative. Things like that are actually helping people. That's what you should be doing, is like, you should be actually trying to help people. And that's not where this is going. But I mean, here's the thing. You could get to the heart of this, and you can get to the heart of this. He's going to kill me probably for talking about this, but okay, I know that, like, the Declaration Center sponsors you guys, okay?
Mm-hmm.
When the Declaration Center, so at any center on
Center
campus,
for the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, they have, so what that center is designed to do is, it is designed to create an environment on campus, right, where you can study like the foundations of American freedom, right? Like, they want you studying the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, understanding American history, understanding, economic freedom, understanding all of these different aspects of what it means to be a free person, right? Now, as part of any center, you have to have like an academic, you have to have some academic program on campus.
Mm-hmm.
And so originally, they had suggested, well, let's just have an academic minor in the study of American freedom. So you'll take like some political science classes where you'll like learn about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and things like that. You'll take some history classes where you'll learn about the American Revolution and you'll have some history classes where you learn about slavery and emancipation and these kinds of things. And so that was the original idea. And a lot of faculty members were like, I think that's too narrow because it's just focused on American freedom. Like, why wouldn't you focus on freedom?
We live in America.
Yes. So why wouldn't you focus on freedom overall? So this is the thing. So they actually said, okay, well, as part of this minor, then what we'll do is we will expand it. We'll make it about freedom generally. And so it'll be freedom generally. So it won't be confined to the United States. It's also going to address the issue of freedom from the perspective of the political process. There's going to be there's going to be a study of freedom from there would be a political science aspect to it. There would be an economic aspect to it. There would be a philosophical aspect to it, and there would be a historical aspect to it. So history, philosophy, economics, and political science, you're going to get a little bit of all of those things where you're going to learn about various aspects of freedom and what it means to be free and struggles for freedom and all these kinds of things and where that freedom comes from. And you're going to study this from a variety of different perspectives. Right. So you can go to the economics department and you can learn about economic freedom. You can go to the political science department and you can learn about, constitutional government and things like that. You can go to the history department and you can learn about the American Revolution or about, or about the emancipation from slavery. You can go to the philosophy department and you can learn about all of these different ways that people have thought about freedom, throughout history. Like you can learn what Aristotle thought of freedom and how that differs from what Nietzsche thought of freedom and all these kinds of things. Right. One faculty member in this meeting said, I'm opposed to this because it's going to attract the wrong kind of people.
Jesus.
The wrong kind of people.
The wrong kind of people.
My greatest regret in life is I didn't ask a follow-up question to say, can you define who these wrong people are?
I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed.
Are these wrong types of people in the room with us now?
Yeah, could you point them out?
And so this is the issue. When they talk about academic freedom, this is why I don't take them seriously. What was just described, you cannot tell me that that's not worth studying. You cannot tell me that it's not worth learning about our founding documents. You can't tell me that it's not worth learning about the differences between capitalism and communism. You can't tell me it's not worth learning about how, philosophers have defined freedom and thought about freedom over centuries, right? You cannot tell me that taking history classes and learning about people's fights and struggles for freedom is not a valuable learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
And yet these people sat there and said, no, I'm opposed to this because it's going to attract the wrong kinds of people.
Because they were concerned that it would attract people who favored capitalism, because they were afraid that it would factor people who maybe had a predisposition towards patriotism, towards love of country. I mean, what? I mean, I'm lost. I mean, I know specifically what it is they're saying, but if you pinned them down and said, no, get specific, what would that be?
Well, what it really is,
because that's not relegated to just white men.
Yeah.
It's not. I know plenty of blacks, Hispanics, people who are second generation Americans who haven't been in this country all that long, who worship freedom. You know what I mean? I mean,
because in academic circles, freedom is a right-wing coded word. Like that's honestly what it is that right-wingers are concerned with freedom. What left-wingers see themselves as being concerned with as justice. That's what they see themselves as being concerned about. And that's what all of this gets back to, is they see themselves as social justice activists,
mm-hmm.
and that should be the purpose of all of these things. And that's not the purpose of all of these things. That's not the purpose of a university. That should not be the mission of the university. And
the purpose of the university is to educate.
Yes. And here's the thing. There are elements to the study of freedom that are actually about justice.
Of course.
Right?
Of course.
If you think about slavery, yes, slavery was about freedom, right? Like emancipation was about freedom,
mm-hmm.
but there's an element that's about justice, right? It's about treating men equally.
Yes.
Right? So this is about justice and freedom. Okay. But the thing is like the modern college campus sees freedom and justice as being antithetical. Like some people are concerned about freedom. Some people are worried about justice. They think that when people reference freedom, that what they're really trying to do is they're trying to skirt a conversation about justice, like that by having, that social justice is going to limit your freedoms. Well, in some cases, it is going to limit your freedoms, and you should have a discussion about that. Okay. But the point is that's how they see it. They see these things as the antithesis of one another. They see these things as countervailing forces, right? Like there's
Right.
freedom on the one side, and then there's justice on the other side.
And refuse to embrace, because that's the deal, right? You have to embrace the nuance of America. I mean, if you study the American Revolution, I mean, it's pretty wild. And just only 85, 90 years later, you had the Civil War, which was about, at its heart, slavery, which is the great stain on our nation. We're still a very young country as compared to the European countries that everyone talks about. You know, America's, is it next summer's our 250th birthday? We're going to have the big party and the whole deal. It's an opportunity to actually teach people about the complexities of the country. But that's almost like forbidden. There's this desire. I know you have to go. There's this desire to rewrite American history to make it, I don't know, kinder, wash over some things, but to paint founding fathers in a light that does not accurately portray the perspective of the day in which they lived. I mean, if someone were to come back 600 years from now and watch this podcast, God forbid, they might view us differently in a way that would be completely unfair and absurd, because there was no way for us today to envision, okay, well, here's what society will be like in 600 years. No, we're living in today.
But this is, again, a problem of the left, is that progressives see the world as the inevitable march of progress.
Towards some form of utopia.
Right. And so they're just on this inevitable march of progress. And so if you're in the way, you're on the quote unquote wrong side of history, right? Like we're going this way, whether you like it or not, but this way is defined by them.
Yeah.
Right. And it's constantly changing, and the definition is constantly changing. And so the thing about this is that you cannot have, you cannot allow this kind of thinking to be so dominant. Like, this kind of thinking is dominant everywhere, right? Like, this kind of thinking dominates all of our discourse. It dominates the media. It dominates academic conversations. It dominates everything. This is why college students don't feel free to speak up in class, because this kind of discourse dominates things. When you portray everything as like an inevitable march of progress, if you're against it, if you're sitting there and saying, nah, you know what, I don't think that's a good idea, you have to stand up and say, I'm against what you're calling progress.
Right.
Okay. At which point, number one, who's against progress? Okay. But number two, like, who wants to be the person identified as the person against progress?
Nobody.
And so the way that people talk about things has to stop. The way that,
because if you stand up and say it, even if what you say is completely sensical, you're going to be labeled a racist, a sexist, a bigot, a homophobe, or something. They're going to throw some label at you to silence you. When in reality, you're none of those things. You're simply saying, no, it's just what you're saying is something I don't believe.
But part of this too is it's a moral. It's like this total moralizing force, right? It's everything has to be interpreted through some moral philosophy that this person has, right? Like that, everything has to be interpreted through that scheme. This is why they look back on American history and they judge people. This is why they're constantly complaining, oh, this person's embarrassing, this person's embarrassing. First of all, no one is going to hold up to scrutiny. No historical figure is going to hold up to close scrutiny, okay? Because everyone is flawed. Everyone has something about them that is bad. Everybody has done things they regret. Everybody has done bad things, and sometimes they don't even regret the bad things that they've done. But the point is that this is always the case. It's always the case that there are people who are important figures in history who have done bad things. And the idea that we have to only judge them by the bad things and we don't talk about the good things, or that we have to somehow be embarrassed by these things. No, there's nobody in the history of the world who has a monopoly on bad decisions. There's nobody who has a monopoly on mistakes. There's nobody who has a monopoly on things that we would find morally reprehensible. You can find these examples throughout human history. You can find them all over the place. What our job is to try to do is to try to understand how people made the decisions they made within the context that they made them. And you have to do that. But but the problem is that the modern left wants us to look everything through they want us to look at everything through modern eyes. They want us to interpret everything through today's morality. They want to interpret things through where we ended up. So if we ended up here, that must be good. And so if you were trying to prevent us from getting here, you must be bad. No, I reject that entire premise. I'm not interested in that. That's not a study of history. And that is how you get people who actually know nothing about the world. That's how you get people who are sanctimonious about what they don't know. They think that they're very, very smart because they know these things, but they really don't know any of the context. They don't know any of the history. They don't know any of the sort of decision-making process that went into these things. You see this everywhere. And the thing is that it has to stop, and we have to reject it. When people who don't believe in academic freedom start lecturing you about academic freedom, that's when you walk away. That's when you stop listening. When people start lecturing you about the morality of Abraham Lincoln, like, that's when you walk away. When people start telling you that Thomas Jefferson was not a great man, because he did these bad things and possibly had a child with a slave, like, that's irrelevant to the historical conversation. Like, it's an interesting thing. It's a thing that you should learn about. You should learn about a person's flaws.
It points out that he was human.
Right. But we should not say, like, oh, the Declaration of Independence is garbage because this person did something terrible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so we should not tear down, the University of Virginia. We should not tear down, statues of Thomas Jefferson. And that's the thing, is that this entire thing, this inevitable march of progress, there's a reason why they want to tear these people down, and there's a reason why they want to tear down statues. There's a reason why they want to make these people out to be the worst people who ever lived. The reason is that they want to create a new society.
Yes.
They want to create a new society. They want to move towards their utopia, and you are in the way. And you know who else is in the way? Thomas Jefferson's in the way. And you know who else is in the way? Abraham Lincoln's in the way. And Washington and Grant and all of these great people that have statues all across the country, those people are in the way. And so they have to tear down those monuments.
The attack on George Washington is the one that, for me, is like, your ignorance is simply revealed in this moment to the point that it's disqualifying.
Well, and they can't stop themselves, because they have to destroy all of those good elements of our society. They have to, those uniting elements, right? That we all look to George Washington as, like, this is kind of like the founder of the country, right? Like, the first president. This is how we look at it.
Literally doesn't happen without him.
No, and so you have to look. They have to destroy these people, because that's how they move on to the thing that they want to create. They're trying to found something new.
Yeah.
Okay. But we already founded something valuable. And so we need to be committed to sticking to that founding and rejecting any attempt to found something new, and we have to reject this idea that there's this inevitable march of progress and that we're all in the way. No. Like, American history is the most fascinating part of modern history. It is the most fascinating part of modern history. In fact, if you look at American history, if you were to take somebody from, say, the 1650s, okay, and you were to drop that person in Europe today, they'd understand Europe. If you were to take that person from Europe and you were to drop them into the United States today, it would be completely unrecognizable. They would not have any idea how to understand what they were observing.
Right.
That is a remarkable story. It's a story that deserves to be told, and I'll be damned if these people who want to tear everything down are going to tell me otherwise.
All right. Yeah, I know you have to go. In the event that you had won an award at this faculty meeting, what flag would you have draped yourself in?
The American flag.
It's my understanding that someone won an award and that was not the flag.
No, they did one with lots and lots of colors.
Lots and lots of colors. Yeah. Who doesn't love colors, All the colors of the rainbow.
There are many good colors.
So many good colors. All right, Josh, got to go. Appreciate everyone being with us in the stream. Put this up in podcast form as well. If you're listening to it, it's already in podcast form. Until next time, for Josh Hendrickson, I'm Neal McCready. Take care.